Today I'm representing Community Shares of Greater Cincinnati. We are an organization that does fundraising for local social justice, economic equity, and environmental causes, and we're really excited to be a part of this. Community Shares has been around for 20 years, and the great thing about Community Shares is that we all come together, this really great diversity of nonprofits who are doing work really out there, in many ways touching issues of poverty. And so when the citywide conversation started about child poverty and poverty in general, we said, hey, let's jump in and let's get some of our folks who are so articulate and really tapped in and tuned into the issue to share their knowledge, right? And so my excitement about it is the fact that I'm a social worker, and for many years I've been doing work in sort of the macro social work areas, which are sort of community organizing and policy and legislative advocacy. And so I also teach poverty at UC at the college level. There's a course called Poverty in America that I have taught, and so I can take a whole semester and talk about poverty in America. And one of the things that we know when we teach about poverty is that there are actual solutions, that there are solutions to poverty. There's causes and there's solutions. Part of what precipitated this planning between Justin, Jeffrey, and I was that we attended a, Steve, I'm going to get you for that. Okay, so we attended this event, and it was, so Lynn Marmer is sort of the head of the Child Poverty Collaborative United Way, and she made some opening remarks, and part of her remarks were that we really don't know what causes poverty. We're really not sure what the solutions are, and we're really just sort of exploring. And some of us were really frustrated by that because, in fact, from an academic and a scholarly perspective, we actually do know what the causes of poverty are, and there are actually some real solutions. So, so that sort of propelled us into being interested in talking about this. So, I just want to touch on a few things that I think are important as a part of this discussion, right? So, so the American experience is very much has been about talking about poverty, right? And in American life, our recent past includes child labor, children working, enslavement, state-sponsored terror, controlling African American folks in the South, gross gender inequality, individuals with disabilities and mental illness literally chained in institutions, locked up, and the list goes on. So any honest look at American life in the not-so-distant past, and even today, reveals the reality of systemic discrimination that for many brings them very far away from the American dream. So we actually have legal structures, systemic structures in America that literally prevents groups from building wealth, participating in democracy through discriminatory practices such as lending practices, banking, redlining, mass incarceration, and the list goes on. And so here we are today, slipping further and further away from a shared prosperity. Again, nothing new to the American experience. In fact, if you study social movements, we find there's a cycle of people's movements that have risen up to respond for their survival and justice throughout our history. And so as we sit here today talking about these issues, we are really just a few of thousands over decades who have gathered, organized, and fought for civil rights and a fairer economy where everyone can realize their full potential, right? So this is sort of the frame in which some of us come into this discussion, right? So when the local corporate business community decides they'd like to, take a crack at reducing poverty, and they want to convene task forces and hire consultants to sort of reduce or ameliorate poverty, what we in the social justice community, we who are part of people's movements from disability rights to gay rights to women's rights to civil rights to Black Lives Matters, to prisoners' rights, to labor rights. We come in with this framework in which we are saying, instead of talking about mentoring and after-school programs and the need for poor children to have somebody there after school, instead, can we talk about the fact that mom and dad have to work 2 jobs just to pay rent, and that if they could just have 1 job, they could actually be at home and spend time with their children, doing homework and reading and all that great stuff that wealthier parents get to do. So, it's sort of a shift in looking at what's important and what the priorities are. So this event that we put together today and for later this evening is about shifting the perspective and doing the courageous work of calling out the systems that exacerbate poverty. And they are right here in Cincinnati. And that's what Justin and I really want to focus on is, we've just come out of the Bernie Sanders thing. Everybody's talking about the 1%, and all of it's really sort of, I don't know, at this level, right? But guess what? Systems right here in Cincinnati are affecting poverty, right? And so I can tell you that as Justin and I tried to reach out to certain folks to speak on these issues, there were people who were actually not comfortable speaking publicly. I mean, that's how sort of courageous it is to sometimes talk about these things. But we found a good, courageous few, and they're going to talk today and later tonight. So with this important lens of a social justice lens, right, we want to name and talk about and uplift those parts of the poverty discussion that include race and discrimination and class and the experience of the working poor. Because some of us might forget that talking about jobs is clearly not enough, because there are actually quite many people who work not even just 1 job but 2 jobs and yet are still not able to participate economically. So if you look back at recent history, looking at the civil rights movement and the relief movement or the welfare movement, there was this whole movement, and not a lot of people, unless you were there or kind of get into studying this stuff, there was this, the National Welfare Rights Organization for a time. There was this time when people were organizing around relief and welfare. There were groups like the Committee to Save the Unemployed Fathers of Eastern Kentucky, and the Chicago Welfare Union of the West Side Organization, and the Ohio Committee for Adequate Welfare, right? And so if you look over our history of really the national consciousness of the early 60s of saying we are going to fight poverty, like this is a national issue now. And so the emergence of poverty as a national issue in the 60s, right? And the shift of civil rights activists moving from civil rights over to economic rights. And just the famous quote of Martin Luther King saying, what good is it, and I'm going to paraphrase here, I'm sorry, I don't think, but what good is it if I can sit at the lunch counter but I can't order a hamburger, right? So I'm at the lunch counter now, but I need to be able to buy a hamburger, right? So, and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that happened in August of 1963, and that was really calling out, and their list of demands, if you read them, they are similar to the demands that many groups are making today. A living wage, ability to participate economically. So the War on Poverty in 1964 ushered in Community Action Agency system, Mental Health Centers Act created community mental health, deinstitutionalizing folks. And so this created thousands of jobs for new social workers to get into the work of helping people access government aid. There's this whole great story about anti-poverty lawyers there was this whole huge group of lawyers who started helping people access welfare and fight against eligibility rules such as, men in the home rules, and there was all these, a lot of sophisticated rules about whether people could access relief or not, and those were challenged and those were won. And in the mid-60s, so we had major social upheaval, both related to civil rights movement and the welfare relief movement. In 1966, there was 21 major uprisings across cities in America. In 1967, that grew to 83 major uprisings. And that precipitated a federal civil disobedience task force formed and a presidential riot commission. And what that task force came out and said, there's people rioting the streets, and there was rent strikes and rent riots and all this really interesting stuff going on. And that task force, back in 1967, recommended a massive and sustained commitment to action to end poverty and racial discrimination. And in February of 1968, a presidential address called on the training and hiring of unemployed to help rebuild the cities, right? So the point is that these conversations we're having today are nothing new, right? We've been around this rodeo many times, and some of you in this room were part of that movement back then. And so the point here is that instead of, the frustration I personally have had is as if like we're looking at this for the first time. And in fact, there's nothing new about poverty, and there's nothing new about people talking about it. And in fact, if you look at the wins that the civil rights movement had, the wins that the welfare relief movement had, we got to a point, and I'm not going to take the next speaker's thunder here, Steve, but we actually got to a place in America where we had actually we were getting out of lots and lots of people living in poverty. We were like really getting there. And then Nixon came, and there was this real shift back to conservative, law and order type discussions, stuff we're hearing today about self-reliance, and this whole welfare fraud thing happened, and they started doing audits and investigations, and really the whole welfare reform movement started happening. And so I'm going through this really quick, but the point is that sit back and enjoy, right, these speakers, because the point is that we've done this before. We know what the solutions are, and I'm going to just list them in my closing here. And let's just start with the ugly reality that we are living in an America today where every social institution in American life has a legacy of racism and discrimination, right? From housing to transit to voter rights to work life. So if we want to approach the question of poverty with genuine concern, the context of those systems, the tools of oppression, some call them, they have to be named and exposed and grappled with. Because either we're getting closer to a true level playing field and true equality, or we're not, and we're operating still within unfair systems and unequal systems, and that's the kind of discussion I'd like to see happening around poverty. So just to touch on some solutions. Many of you know these, right? And you've heard them before. And if you simply Google, how do you solve poverty? This is what you'll find, right? Raise the minimum wage, paid family leave, sick leave, fair and predictable work schedules, enforcement of labor laws, dignified retirement through the expansion of Social Security, pension protections, quality public education, investment in infrastructure, which in turn creates jobs, like rebuilding our bridges and railroads and roads, extension of federal unemployment insurance, subsidized employment has worked in many cases, expansion of earned income tax credit, support of pay equity and fair pay, affordable high quality child care, and the list goes on. Reforms in the criminal justice system, enacting policies that support successful reentry. So many of you know these, and what we're hoping for is that as our friends on the corporate side of the question here come out with their whatever the blue ribbon banner recommendations, we're hoping that we're going to actually see these proven best practices in how to really address systemic poverty. And I've listed just a few of those. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Steve, and he can introduce himself.